So this project is greenhushing. So we're looking at some potentially unintended consequences of a disclosure regime that's conditionally mandatory. And this is joint work with Mandy Lester, who is on Zoom, if you see us on Zoom. She's at Texas State University. So in our project, what are we looking at? So we're looking at how a conditionally mandatory reporting regime shapes managers' internal decision making. So what does that mean? So we'll talk a little bit more about what we mean by a conditionally mandatory reporting regime and in our specific setting. So we want to explore this broad question in the setting of the SEC's climate rule, the recently proposed climate rule. It's kind of stuck in the litigation process right now. I'll talk a little bit about that. And in our early set of analyses, we look at how these effects depend based on whether the firm is already doing the underlying activity and managers' perceived risk of litigation. And so we're kind of at a point where we've done an initial set of work, and that has kind of led us to draw some insights from that work. And we're starting to think about what do we want to do next. And so right now, what we're currently considering is exploring how investors might respond differently to firms' disclosures under a conditionally mandatory reporting regime. So we explored both of these questions because this is a rule that hasn't come out yet. We explored both of these questions using an experimental design where we survey participants and sort them into different scenarios and ask for kind of their behavior, how they would behave in that scenario. So this is kind of where we're going. We're in a great spot because we're in between the first and second experiment. So we're very excited to hear your feedback. So if you have any questions as we're going through this, please just raise your hand. We'd love to hear from you. So that's where we're at now. So before we dig in, I do want to spend a little bit of time talking about climate change related scenario analyses, because that's the setting that we're going to be looking at. And so what is a climate related scenario analysis? So the goal of these analyses is to help managers and investors understand how climate change is going to have strategic and operational consequences for a business. This can be risks, this can be opportunities, so there's upsides and downsides. It's largely modeling through what would happen to your business under different maintained assumptions of how the climate will evolve. So in the specific setting of the SEC climate rule that we'll discuss, climate-related scenario analyses typically consists of a firm laying out a few assumed scenarios about how global warming will proceed, and then thinking through, okay, if something is happening under this scenario, what are the consequences of that pathway for us as a firm? So I'll present a couple of examples. So a lot of firms are already doing some of this because there's voluntary reporting frameworks that ask for this. And so we have a couple of examples here. So this is Zara's climate-related scenario analysis. So they do a very kind of qualitative where they think about what could happen to how impacted will their business be? And it's this color-coded chart that just kind of directionally highlights the biggest impact based on climate change under each of these different scenarios. They also supplement that with a lot of discussion, so a lot of qualitative discussion in the text here. So kind of in today's voluntary reporting regime, there's a lot of discretion. So if we look at National Grid, they provide a bit more detail where they have kind of three different scenarios. They're modeling fewer scenarios, but they talk about how they expect these scenarios to differ in their UK business versus their US business. And they also provide some quantitative assessments. So they talk about under each of these scenarios, how do they anticipate things like heat pump usage, electricity demand, and natural gas demand to evolve, given that they're a utilities company. So theirs is quite detailed, right? They put some quantitative analysis behind it, and they're currently voluntarily disclosing it. Somewhere in the middle, we have General Motors. This is their qualitative climate-related scenario analysis that they're disclosing voluntarily. So they model three scenarios, and they talk about kind of some broad categories and discuss it qualitatively. So kind of in our current setting, there's a wide range of how firms are putting this information out there on a voluntary basis. And that's where the SEC's climate rule came in. This is part of a broader environment of voluntary climate change related reporting, where firms are trying to put out some information about how their businesses will be affected by climate change, but investors are worried about comparability and consistency across firms. So, yes.
Just a general question about these disclosures that the companies were already providing. Are they giving any kind of horizon related to this? Meaning, so is this kind of a 1 year, 5 year, 10 year, right? When they say will affect our business, the will, are they defining the will and giving any information about that, or just leaving it pretty open-ended?
So in the current regime, it's very much up to the firm. So if we go back to National Grid, right, they have these different scenarios and they have different years, right? They have 24, 2035, and 2050. I mean, if we go all the way back to Zara's, though, they have a short related assessment. They say this is 0 to 5 years. They have similar grids for medium, kind of 5 to 10 years and 10 years and beyond. But then if we look at kind of General Motors, they don't specify like a range. So in the current environment, it's kind of up to the firm. And in the context of the SEC's climate rule, a lot of their discussion is we just want the firms to keep doing what they're doing. But if you're doing it, tell us what you're doing, whatever that may be. We'll look at some of the specific language and kind of as where we got the idea for our initial experiment in terms of thinking through the pieces. But I think the SEC and they didn't want to necessarily prescribe specifics on this dimension. Yeah. And so the rule more generally, what the aim at the time when the rule was proposed in 2022 and adopted in 2024 was to provide this consistent disclosure of climate-related risks and opportunities so investors can make better decisions about their investment choices. So there were a lot of different provisions. The provision that we're specifically interested in is going to be this conditionally mandatory nature of scenario analysis. There's other provisions about disclosing your scope 1 emissions, providing a qualitative discussion of your climate-related risks and opportunities, etc. So this rule has been a bit contentious over time, right? So the rule came out in 2022, it was proposed, and then in 2024, they adopted the rule and it was challenged in court. In March 2025, the SEC chose to stop defending the rule. So, kind of from a practical perspective, we might consider that kind of the end of the rule. But I think what's very interesting is that in September 2025, the US Court of Appeals basically said, well, we can't just leave the rule in limbo. We are going to pause all of our litigation until the SEC makes a decision on whether they want to defend it, they amend it, or rescind the rule. And any option aside from defending the rule as written is going to open up a comment period again. So right now it's kind of paused. So the US Court of Appeals has the litigation in abeyance, been basically saying the SEC needs to take a clear position on what they'd like to do with this. So what's the consequence is that even if kind of the current political environment means that regulators choose not to do anything or choose not to make a decision over what they'd like to do, any future administration could pick it up very quickly if they chose to defend it as written. If the SEC chooses in the near term that they actually would like to formally rescind the rule, that's going to open up a brand new comment period that people would be able to comment on. So it's kind of in limbo right now. So it's a developing series of regulations. So we'll see what happens. What do we mean when we say a conditionally mandatory reporting regime? So when we think reporting, like financial reporting or any sort of reporting, there's some pieces that are mandatory. So these are SEC rules that say that all preparers have to tell us something. So for example, all SEC filers, if you have to file a 10K, you have to put a balance sheet in the 10K, for example. Then there's voluntary reporting where firms can choose if they include something or not. So if a firm chooses to put out a CDP survey answer or answer the survey or talk to investors, that can be voluntary. And in between is kind of this conditionally mandatory reporting that we're talking about, where in the regulation, it says if the preparer does something, either they gather information or does this underlying activity, then they have to tell us about that information or that activity. But if you don't do it, then there's nothing to report on. So this is where climate-related scenario analysis comes in. So in the SEC climate rule, we have this provision where they say in the final rule, their requirement over disclosing scenario analysis is going to depend on whether and how the registrant uses the analysis. And they were very careful to say, we do not want this rule to require somebody to conduct scenario analysis. More of a, if you do it, we'd love to hear about it, but do not read this rule as saying you must go do it.
Is there
Yeah.
a precedent for this? Man, this is just kind of a weird, as I'm sitting here, it's
Yeah.
like a weird way to structure a regulation. It's like-
So the closest analogy that we've come up with is segment reporting. So when the regulations require that you report on your reportable segments, a lot of firms came out and said, we are one segment. And then they changed the rule to say, you have to give us your segments the way that you organize internally. And then there's a nice academic literature that shows segments started to move around a little bit in there. There are some jurisdictions that are planning to require scenario analysis. I think California tried to require it, but then that is currently being litigated as required, quote unquote, required speech, right? Yeah, compelled speech. Another kind of piece, a lot of popular press at the time that this came out mentioned that a lot of preparers were really worried about compliance costs, right? Because this was part of a broader, like the climate rule has all sorts of stuff in there. And a lot of the comments during the commentary period were like, as firms, we appreciate that investors want standardized information. We understand that, but we are really worried about the compliance costs to prepare everything that we need to comply. And so we would like to not be mandated to do everything if it's not something that we're already doing in that sense. I think that's one component. I think another component is some people in the commentary process express some concerns that, hey, you're making us disclose, if you make us disclose everything here, I'm revealing a lot of the business, right? So some things I'd rather not. Yes.
Be more compelling to, even if it's voluntary, to actually give some standardization
Hmm.
to the, let's call it minimum
Sure.
disclosure. So now the companies who are voluntarily disclosing, they're disclosing in a different way,
Hmm.
non-standardized. We can't even compare, we can't even understand
Hmm.
which one is doing better than the other in the transition, for example.
Right. I think that was the tricky part that they were trying to balance is that like by moving some of this into the 10K, they were hoping that at least we can have some standardization of like, okay, here's the section where you're going to bullet point your assumptions. Here's the section where you're going to bullet point what opportunities that you came up with or risks that you came up with versus kind of the voluntary regime we have now is a bit kind of the Wild West, right? If you think about those three examples that we had, quite different varying levels of detail and assumptions kind of located in different places. So I think that was the goal of the SEC was even if we get people that all have different assumptions, if we can get them to put all the assumptions in the same place, then maybe that's helpful. To repeat the question, I think if I sum it up right, it's kind of, well, what about firms who are, like, what about firms who are required to report elsewhere? Is this regulation just designed to magnify that piece? I think there is a component to that where it's the intent here is we want to minimize the marginal cost as much as possible. So I think the original intent was if you're already doing this reporting for some other jurisdiction, great. Please copy and paste in this like different format. But if you don't have to do it for some other jurisdiction, they're very clear. This is not intended to make you go do it. So I think in some senses, there is a bit of a piggybacking effect going on for the firm, for the regulators here. Some of it is, I'm sure, political, trying to minimize the political cost of getting this proposal out the door, because it was contentious even right at the jump, right? So, and I think some of it is also thinking through, like, trying to be considerate of the potential preparation costs to comply here. So in terms of who's defining the scenarios, that is still up to the firm. It's just that this requirement was intended to say, whatever assumptions you chose or whatever scenarios you chose to model, you need to tell us what those scenarios are. Probably, so do we observe differences in industries? If we went through and kind of looked at what's out there today, there's huge, I would suspect that there's a lot of variation between firms, even just in the three examples that we looked at earlier. there's huge variation in terms of what time horizon we're looking at, how detailed you are, how you classify the different risks, right? I think Zara had like more subcategories than General Motors did. I think in our experimental setting, what we are trying to do is try and abstract away from some of that and to try and focus on, okay, does the structure of this regulation, does the way that it's structured inadvertently give some people an out to stop doing something that maybe they were interested in doing? Yeah.
It's definitely not optimal. Well, I think the way you can shape, the way you can select,
Sure.
creates huge selection biases in any direction.
And I think that was known and anticipated as part of this. Like, this was never, I don't think anyone who was in favor of this really got into that goal endpoint, right? This is a stepping stone to get towards something more harmonized. But when most firms are not into disclosing at all, it's hard to tell everybody you have to do it exactly this way for all industries. You know, there's too many aspects to try to define that. I think the idea was, let's let people experiment and we'll see what sticks, and then we can say like, okay, this seems to be the winning answer. This is the most popular, most efficient, whatever. This is the like, let the kind of market experiment and decide which should become the standards in the future. This is not the end point. This is a like step towards getting to a standardized way of disclosure.
Yes.
I'm wondering how the framing of that 2025, like repealing of
Mhm.
the climate rule was. And from my general knowledge, it seemed like very regime motivated, but was it framed as, oh, this rule is too flexible, not prescriptive enough, or was it how did they frame that?
Are you talking about it like the fact that the rule is currently paused and not fully rescinded?
Yes, sorry, in 2025 when they
Right. So the litigation, my understanding is the parties that sued were suing to stop implementation of the rule because they initially filed suit in 2024. It's just that when we got to 2025, right, the SEC is the defendant in this litigation, and so they chose to end they chose to basically say we're not going to show up and rebut any of the claims made by the plaintiffs. And I think the judiciary, I think their argument was, well, as the SEC, this is very confusing, right? Like you know, you should clarify what your position is, one way or the other, through the formal process. I think was the intent of some of that litigation. Okay, and specifically, this is the language that inspired us to pursue this study, is that the final rule provides that if a registrant uses scenario analysis, there's a second if based on financial materiality here, then the registrant must describe a lot of things about the scenario, including the parameters, assumptions, and choices. And so we thought that language was very interesting when it came out in the proposal, and we hadn't seen that many cases of that before where it was intended to be this, you only have to disclose if you do the activity. And that kind of led us to our research question of, okay, how does this structure, having that if, kind of that like that dependency in here where first you have to be the one doing it, then you have to disclose it. The financial materiality part came in later. We would be interested in exploring that possibly. The financial materiality part is more typical of many financial reporting regulations where you might have to disclose something if it's deemed financially material. So this is the language in the final rule that was adopted and litigated that we were extremely interested in studying, and that is what we try to do in our first experiment. We also thought this was very interesting in terms of the regulatory context, because compared to competing regulatory regimes or frameworks, to our knowledge, the SEC's climate rule was the only one that had this if-then reporting structure. So GRI, right, it's voluntary, but IFRS for under S2, when they talk about scenario analysis, S2 itself is voluntary, but conditional on adopting S2, then you'd have to publish a scenario analysis. And then in Europe, right, there's some reporting requirements coming where they're planning to require it. The state of California, interestingly, they kind of had a requirement in one of their two bills that you were going to have to do a scenario analysis and disclose your climate-related risks. And the SEC's was only if you prepared it internally. So we thought that was something really unique and interesting about the SEC's one. The California one is being litigated right now. So it's currently voluntary. There's a companion rule about emissions that is in effect, and they're starting to collect data on that dimension. But the scenario analysis part was going to be required in the California one, and I think that's become a sticking point to your point about compelled speech. I think the question is kind of along the lines of, this is clearly can be very clear that this is financially material and that you'd expect firms to be doing this. I think that's really interesting of a context because one piece of commentary that we've gotten is, especially as we approach our second experiment, is how investors interpret the presence or silence on a scenario analysis could differ based on their ex ante expectations of whether or not you would expect the firm to do one, right? Like if you're running a utility firm, right, or if you're an investor thinking about investing in a utility and they tell you we don't have a scenario analysis, that has a very different implication for your interpretation of management than if you're thinking about investing in a retailer and they're like, we haven't done a scenario analysis. And so we think that's super interesting in terms of thinking about how the context moderates what investors interpret that as. That's something we didn't explore in our first experiment. We held the company constant. And our first experiment put people in the position of being a manager who has to make the disclosure decision. In our second experiment, right now, the way we have it designed is we're still continuing to hold the firm constant. So we kind of can abstract away from some of that dimensionality. But it's something that's really intriguing, and I think we'd be open to exploring probably in a subsequent experiment as well, or kind of depending on how we think through the second experiment, seeing if there's a way for us to incorporate that. There's a lot of potential dimensions that we could manipulate our second experiment, and so just trying to think through what order we want to go in. But I think that's very interesting, this idea of like, there's certainly settings where it's very obvious, like very clearly material, and others where maybe it's more in the eye of the beholder. I saw another two hands. Yes. Oh.
Just a really quick comment. So one of the nice things then about you're approaching this using an experiment is you can abstract away from a lot of sorry to use the word again, but conditional other exposures that real companies would have if they're trying to navigate multiple jurisdictions with different laws, right? So that's what
Right.
But not only that, but also the SEC already has risk materiality disclosure rules, right? So even if you don't get roped in with this thing, if you do face that as a material risk related to climate change, you're supposed to talk about it, right? So they didn't need this rule, right? Maybe not the scenario analysis, but you definitely need discussion about the risk and what the risk impact on the firm is. So the experiment is a nice way to try to isolate the piece that you want, I guess.
Right. Yeah. I think I think some background on this project, when we started this project, we had intended to write two papers. We were going to write this experiment kind of pre-implementation, and then we were going to follow up with an archival paper to study what actually happened. I think the way the world is landing now, we are likely to have this paper, and we may do a follow-up experimental project studying related pieces. I think there's a lot of rich opportunity here, not just in the scenario analysis, but in many other pieces in terms of thinking through what are the forces that are going to shape firms' disclosures as chunks of these disclosures move into a mandatory sphere. Yeah. Yes. No, I think that's a really good question. I think there's two parts to the question, right? I think the first part is kind of how is litigation risk and factoring into this. We did test that in the first experiment in the experiment that we've done so far. We see that having a safe harbor provision doesn't overcome the reduction in scenario analysis planning that happens with the conditionally mandatory regime. But for our participants who were in the voluntary condition, having the safe harbor did encourage more of them to disclose it, conditional on doing it. So we thought that was really interesting. I think to the second part of your question about maybe firms are, because they know if they see the conditionally mandatory, but they still think it's important, they may do the analysis in a way that doesn't formally meet the definitions of a scenario analysis. I think that's definitely something that is very difficult for us to test in the experimental setting because we explicitly hold that constant, right? So we give participants, here is either your scenario analysis or here is your closest competitor scenario analysis, and yours would look the same. Now, do you want to disclose it or not, kind of thing. But I think it's a very interesting idea, right? In the sense of, does the regulation, like, does this conditionally mandatory nature further push down kind of the scale of analysis such that it doesn't meet the definition? I think that could be a really interesting alternative outcome we're thinking about. Because in some senses, you might think if you don't do the analysis as formally, you may not get as much out of it. I'm not sure. I think that would be interesting to explore. And as firms think about, I want to avoid, if I don't want to disclose this, how do I design the analysis in a way that doesn't meet the definition? For sure. But yes, that is one limitation of our experiment is we held constant what the analysis included. Okay, so I think the question is two-part, right? It's kind of like, do the scenario analyses have teeth? Like, do they have impact on real operations? And I think the second part is, I don't remember exactly the second part. How sticky is it? Or is it cheap to turn on and off? So I think from a reporting perspective, I think the anecdotal evidence we've seen has been that it's pretty sticky, right? So once you set it up and you have the processes in place, it's there. Of course, it's always easier to stop than it is to start in some senses, right? Like you could just say, oh, we're going to close that team and lay off those individuals. I think what we saw is whether or not you were already doing it in our experiment, I don't think particularly affected your decision to stop doing it, right? Because you can always lay off that team, so to speak, right? And I think to your first question in terms of, do these analyses have teeth? Like, do they matter for firms? I think anecdotally from investors and regulators, I think they do find it helpful in thinking through, at the very least, understanding how the firm is thinking about it and planning against it. I think the jury is maybe a little bit out on whether we see outcomes correlated with with what any of these firms are saying, right? I mean, so I think that's an open question. I think in our current experiment, we've kind of abstracted away from that a bit, right? Because we've held it constant and we use Zara's materials, and it's actually it's quite directional and qualitative. It's a color-coded heat map. So it doesn't quite have it would be hard to assess how is the firm doing against some of these there. But I think that's super interesting as a concept of okay, clearly some people are interested in this, right? Some investors, some regulators. Then what, right? Once they've got it, then what happens? Are they holding firms accountable for what they put in these analyses? Like, how are these analyses being used on the investor side? I think is potentially very interesting. I'll skip this slide. We spent a lot of time talking about the motivations for a conditionally mandatory regime. I'll kind of breeze through this framework a little bit. In essence, the way that we're currently viewing the framework of how people are thinking about it is managers are balancing these costs and benefits with reporting, both to do the analysis and whether or not to disclose it if it's optional. So in our experiment, in our current experiment, we are testing three hypotheses. One is that essentially the managers are more likely to do a scenario analysis when it's voluntary than conditionally mandatory. And we're going to test whether, if you've done one before, we're going to test the hypothesis that it makes it more likely that you do it. And we're going to test the role of litigation risk in moderating the effect. So how do we do this? We have a 2x2x2 between subjects experiment. So we have 8 different conditions. And we tell participants that they take on the role of a corporate controller and they have to make these reporting decisions. So we're going to manipulate the disclosure regime we're going to manipulate the preparation costs by saying some of you've already done this before, so you just have to update, and some people you haven't done it before. And we tell some people that there is a safe harbor, and we don't tell people about a safe harbor in the other condition. So what happens in the experiment? So we do a financial literacy and experience screen. We give them some background information about the industry, the company, and the reporting environment. Then we sort people into the different conditions, and we make sure people know what condition they're in. We do a manipulation check. We have them look at a climate risk scenarios disclosure. So if they've done it before, we have them look at last year's. If they haven't done it before, we have them look at the same analysis, but we tell them this is for your closest competitor. And if you did an analysis, the results would likely be similar. Then we ask them to make some decisions. Do you want to do this? Do you want to disclose it? If you're in the voluntary condition, right? If you're in the conditionally mandatory condition, you have to disclose it. And, kind of some measures of their thought process behind this. And then we do a post-experimental questionnaire where we ask them some demographics questions and questions about their risk preferences. So we recruited about 400 people. We filtered for people with some management experience, and we gave them a financial literacy screen. So what did we find? So we found that preparers are much less likely to prepare scenario analysis in a conditionally mandatory regime than a voluntary regime. And our two interventions to reduce the incremental disclosure costs or preparation costs were not effective. So we see the conditionally mandatory effect, even if we give participants a safe harbor, and even when they've already done one before. So we thought that was super interesting. So in terms of our experimental results, I'll jump here. Really the main result of our first experiment thus far is that the reporting regime significantly affected the likelihood that you were going to prepare a new scenario analysis. Preparing one before, it is mildly associated with preparing it now, but had kind of unrelated to the reporting regime. So a little bit of like, if you've already done one before, why not do one now? Your marginal costs were lower. The safe harbor did help in general with preparing a scenario analysis, but it didn't vary with the reporting regime. There's no interactive effect. In the voluntary disclosure condition, we also looked at whether the safe harbor influenced the disclosure decision amongst the voluntary participants, because they have a second choice, right? Once they've chosen whether or not to prepare one, then they make a decision, do I want to tell people about it? And we found that the safe harbor does encourage voluntary disclosure of the scenario analysis, especially among people that didn't prepare one previously. So especially amongst first timers, which we thought was interesting. Yeah. Thinking through past investor demand, in this first experiment, we kind of abstracted away from it, right? We didn't tell people much, if at all, about past investor demand. We are going to try to get at that, how investors view the scenario analysis in our follow-up experiment, where in our current design, our plan is to say, we're going to put participants in the shoes of an investor, and then we're going to vary whether or not the firm prepares one, and then we will measure kind of investors' willingness to invest and reactions to that. I think that'll help us. It's not exactly, I think, what you're trying to get at, right? Because I think what you're trying to say is managers' perceptions of investors' demands influencing their decision here. And so I think we're kind of one step behind that. We want to look at investors by themselves first, and then see how it affects them, and then maybe subsequently study the two groups together. Yeah. Yes.
A follow-on question to that. Did you talk for a minute about your choice to use a fast apparel company as your setting as opposed to anything else?
Yeah.
So why that as opposed to a utility or
Sure.
an oil company or something like that?
Yeah, I think for the fast apparel company, I think we chose that for a couple of reasons. We wanted something that was relatable to our participants as like a business they may have interacted with. One, two, we wanted it to be a business where not doing the scenario analysis could be plausibly reasonable, right? If you think about back to our earlier conversation about utilities, right? It's a little strange from an investor perspective that a utility doesn't do one, right? I think that would be my ex ante prior, is that if I'm reading through materials for a utility, I would expect that somebody somewhere inside the company has thought about this. So I think we chose a setting. We wanted to choose an industry and a firm where it was maybe closer to in the eye of the beholder how critical it was to have done this right now. Yeah.
So you need a Goldilocks industry where
Tricky,
it's
yeah.
reasonable but not obvious.
Yeah, yeah.
Either.
I think so. Yeah, yeah. That was our motivation there. I think this conversation about how does the industry setting shape these decisions, I think is really interesting, right? I think if we looked at a utility here, we might get different results, right? We might get more, like we might see a smaller hushing effect, I would expect, because managers feel guilty about it. Yeah.
You could find, so use Zara, right,
Mhm.
which is European
Yes.
listed, right? So they're subject to EU regulation,
Mhm.
probably suggest why they're doing that. If you could find a US counterpart
Okay.
that is providing, right, if you just look at 10 retailers,
Sure.
there are a couple that are doing it, just illustrative to suggest and justify why this company is in that gray zone. So some are doing it, some are not doing it voluntarily. Even
Yep.
in the US, that might be a really good way to.
Well, yeah, yeah. No, that's really helpful. So I think one thing we can do is maybe if we did a descriptive stat of if we have
Yeah,
25 American apparel companies, what percentage
exactly.
do it? Because
It's not zero, right?
yeah, I don't think it's zero. I'm pretty confident it's not 100%. Yeah. I think that this idea of like there is a lot of peer norms and peer benchmarking. I think Eddie, you have a paper related to this about like firms benchmarking their disclosures against industry peers in this setting. I think that'd be an interesting potential like thing to incorporate in a future experiment. So for better or worse, in the experiment that we ran, we kind of like we did not choose that as one of the factors we wanted to manipulate, but that could be interesting. Yeah. Yeah.
The equilibrium as you play the game forward
Mhm.
is that you gravitate towards the leaders. Well, that
Right.
makes sense, right? What's nice about this setting is that we're not at equilibrium point yet, right?
Mhm.
The SEC is waffling and you have
Mhm.
it's a very contentious area. So there may be, that variety is gonna be good for you.
Sure,
Because
yes.
again, that suggests that we haven't hit that equilibrium point where, of course, everyone should do it because the top three firms are doing it, we gotta be comparable.
Yeah, I think also the California rule being litigated helps us a lot from a motivation because you could easily argue, well, this is basically mandatory because if you have to report for California, that means you do one. The SEC is going to know you do one, and you're going to have to park it here. So I think the fact that the California rule is being quite actively litigated right now, I think is also quite helpful for us. Okay, yes, yeah. So I mean, this is a very contentious issue. Like how much of this do we want, right? In some senses, this is also very forward-looking, right? So, yeah. So just in table form, we have the decision to disclose here as well. I'm going to skip this and jump to our planned second experiment. So I've talked a little bit about this, but in a second experiment, what we want to do is we want to look at how investors themselves are going to respond to the reporting regime. So we will have conditionally mandatory, voluntary, and mandatory regimes, and we want to see how the reporting regime and how whether or not the firm discloses, how that affects participants' willingness to invest, their risk assessments of the firm, and how they view managers' credibility. So we're also planning to continue to hold the firm constant. We're going to use the materials that we used for the managers one, but just change what we present, how we frame what gets presented to the participants. We're going to vary the reporting regime, and we're going to vary whether or not they're told that this is being disclosed, right? So in the voluntary and conditionally mandatory, we can vary that, right? And then the mandatory is just a benchmark because there's no variation. Everybody has to report it. So that's what we're planning to do. We're planning to measure, so these are some of the measures we're planning to use. So how likely would you be to invest? Some measures on risk perceptions, how risky do you think the stock will be? And some perceptions of managers' credibility. So how credible do you view management? So we're planning, yes.
Have you thought about turning the dial on cost to interpret? So imagine you're an investor and your role is sitting at asset manager with
Sure.
$2 trillion and you got a big team working for you. You can interpret what these things do and how they map into financial materiality. in a way that Joe average retailer, right, is now just
Mm,
throwing darts at a wall
okay,
kind of
yeah.
idea. Is that a manipulation you could try to think about turning?
Like a bit about like the incremental processing costs for the investor, like how easy or how difficult.
Exactly.
I think that's interesting. I think we haven't thought that much about it, but one thing we could do is manipulate how easy to read that graph, that table is, right? Because right now we're giving them Zara's, which is it's color coded. It's
Yeah, that's straightforward.
not a ton of details, but it's pretty straightforward. You could imagine if we gave them something more like National Grids that has like all these tiny little figures in it, you could have information overload. I think
Mhm.
in the second experiment, we maybe wanted to focus more on the reporting regime by itself. I think we could see ourselves doing at least one or two more follow-up experiments beyond that. And that could be really interesting in terms of like firms are still going to have some variation in how much they put into the scenario analysis, right? Because you can choose to disclose, you have to disclose all your assumptions, but you can choose to make 2 assumptions or 15 assumptions, right? If we think about National Grid, they had a lot of assumptions about the EV adoption curve, the heat pump adoption curve, how that differed between the UK, Massachusetts, and New York, right? Whereas if we think about General Motors, they only had 4 degrees, 2 degrees, 1 degree, right? So I think there's an opportunity to vary that. I think we're not planning at this time to do that in the second experiment, but for sure we see ourselves running more experiments down the road to get at some of these additional pieces.
Are you trying to dial at all on the quality of the disclosure itself?
So in the second experiment, we're currently not planning to turn the dial on the disclosure itself. We're planning to keep it to be the same disclosure that we had in the first experiment. A little bit also out of convenience because we have the materials developed, but could envision doing that, right? In terms of like right now, we're only giving them the grid and a couple sentences. We could give them the full paragraph that Zara uses subsequently as well, possibly. Yeah. Yes.
In the second experiment, are you going to sort of set the stage around like the goals of the investor, or are you gonna leave it to the respondent, right? In terms of like time
Sure.
orientation, or, if you get someone who's specifically, interested in sustainable investing or things like that, are you gonna set the stage on what type of investment this is, right? And like whether they would include it in a particular portfolio, or is it just sort of left open?
I think in the way that we've currently designed it, we are giving the participants some background about like, some firms prepare this, some firms don't, depending on the condition. This is what it is. It's intended to provide this. And then in terms of the investment objective, I think we're leaving that open to the participants as to how they interpret how applicable that motivation is to their investment objective. I think kind of our goal is that if we have a broad enough kind of cross-swing of people, then it should kind of wash out. We do have some demographics questions at the end where we're going to ask them about their perceptions on ESG, and we'll use those as a cross-sectional split on their interest, I think, yeah.
Who are the participants? Very good people.
Yeah, so they're recruited from Prolific. I mean, it's people paid to take surveys, so it's very interesting because you can screen for minimum levels of certain things. So we screen for some minimum level of like you manage people at work, you've had some reporting requirement, maybe not necessarily directly financial reporting, but you also have some financial expertise as well. I think in the future, some levers that we've considered is in a lot of studies, people use graduate students, so MBA students, pre-professional students as proxies for different things. And so we've considered doing that as well. It's kind of like no matter which pool of participants you choose, there's going to be there's pros and cons with each group because you try to think about, well, who's incentivized to take the surveys, right? Are they sufficiently close enough to the things that you're trying to study? There's always that kind of tension there. So yeah, so these are our dependent measures. And so where do we plan, what is our planned contribution of this study, right? So I think our big contribution is that our work thus far and our future work hopes to highlight this potential trade-offs that the SEC needs to make and any other regulator that's thinking about just these disclosure requirements, that there's trade-offs in using this conditionally mandatory reporting regime, right? So when you're trying to balance these costs of preparation with demand for this information, right? They're sometimes having this kind of structure can lead to people stopping the underlying activity to avoid disclosure. So we think this is informative, not just the SEC, but other regulators, especially those thinking about sustainability reporting. Our findings suggest that even if managers think it's interesting, right? Because most managers did do one, did choose to conduct a scenario analysis. The reporting regime incentivizes at least some of them to stop. And so to build this out a little bit more in the future, we're planning to explore a bit more about how investors respond to this conditionally mandatory regime. Like how are they reacting if we tell them that this is out there, right? What signal are they drawing from the conditionally mandatory regime that might be different from either mandatory or the current state entirely voluntary? Yes.
Mr. Moyer, I want to go back to Lloyd's question before, our last question. Do you feel like the participants believe in the conditionally mandatory regime? Meaning, do they believe that if I'm a manager and I do this, I do it quietly, right? So I'm doing it in the background, right? I just don't cross that threshold, and it's a truly enforceable threshold. Do they have that belief? Is there a way that you can confirm that? Because in the end, if you think, well, I can always do this in the background, I'll just hush it up or keep it quiet or do it a little bit less or drop one little thing or scenario so I don't get officially paying for it. But as a manager, I want this information, right? You're trying to, the real trade-off I think you'd like to show is that as a manager, I'm willing to sacrifice real information so I don't have to comply with a regulatory standard that could put me in legal jeopardy or whatever.
So I think to this question of like to what degree can the managers kind of turn the dial on how much they're doing and like where the minimum threshold is to have to report? I think in the current experiment, we've tried to abstract away from it explicitly by saying it's binary. You either like this is the scenario analysis, it's been done, either for you or for your closest competitor. Do you want to do it? Yes or no? And then depending on the reporting regime, do you want to put it out there or not? So I think kind of in our setting, it's a bit binary. To be fair, I mean, one thing that's super interesting is because we gave them Zara's, it's actually not that detailed. It's not that much stuff to put out there. So you can imagine maybe at least some participants interpreted it as like, oh, this is not that much information. It is some information. But I think it's interesting to think about like how much information, to your point about like how much information are managers willing to give up to not report?
Exactly. Is there a way you could try to get at that experiment? Because that's a truly fascinating question, right? What are you willing to sacrifice as a manager? Get yourself out of some kind of reporting cost, whatever you want to find that cost. That's a real trade-off. Yeah.
No, that's interesting to think about. Yeah, for sure. Yes.
The other side of the point that might be that if you are doing the analysis in-house and not disclosing them because you're under a threshold, say, the danger could be, I'm playing devil's advocate here, that then later on something happens and the investor said, you knew something that you didn't tell me.
So you'd have to reduce your information production so much that you could credibly say that you didn't know. Or you'd have to scatter it so disperse across the organization.
So maybe this goes back to the first question here, like an hour ago, and this goes to your future paper ideas. Could it be that we benchmark this like a conditional mandatory regime to conditional mandatory regime in an area that is not like climate change? Because it's completely different dynamics when it's something that will happen in 2050. Then it's something that your company internalized right now, the cost. So a manager will not be willing to sacrifice information, something that the cost will be internalized right now. The manager may be willing to sacrifice a lot of information when the results are down the road and nobody can verify that.
Yeah, so like thinking about this question of like, what if it were a different setting? We actually did think about it. We thought about instead of doing a second experiment that was how do investors react, our alternative second experiment is, does this effect translate to another setting? So we considered doing our second experiment to still put participants in the manager's lens, but to take them out of the environmental setting, to put them in, say, segment reporting or some sort of financial materiality threshold. I think we debated that quite extensively, and we got some feedback previously that kind of pushed us into the investor direction that we are now, but it's something that we think about a lot, especially with a rule that it's not going to be implemented, but for practical purposes is unlikely to see a lot of regulatory activity for the next couple years. We thought a lot about that choice. So that's really helpful input in that it tells us that there's demand for exploring the possibility of what if we took people out of this environmental setting. And I think I am over time, so I'm going to wrap it up there. So thank you everybody for the wonderful feedback. This is really good timing. We're about to put our second experiment together, and put it through the IRB process, and so it's good timing for that. Great, thanks everybody.